her sonic boom.
When an aircraft goes supersonically, there is a very large boom, and it's heard on the ground, and it can literally break windows.
The sonic boom is a continuously produced explosion of sound, the result of shock waves generated at the front and back of the plane. On the ground, it's heard as two bangs as the aircraft passes overhead.
There was anxiety in the cabinet about the bang, and so on one cabinet occasion I told the Prime Minister I was going to bring Concorde over at midday. So as we got to 12, I was getting a little bit nervous, and then I heard a bit of a bang, and people were sort of slightly shaken by it, but it wasn't as big a problem as anyone had thought.
Concorde's designers also thought her booms wouldn't be too much of a nuisance.
I believe the element of alarm will be absent. It's a very characteristic noise, the double bang. There's no danger of people mistaking it for their mother-in-law shooting themselves.
But tests on the public were not encouraging. And when Concorde flew down what became known as Boom Alley along the west coast of Britain, thousands complained. One woman alleged that the booms had made her pregnant by interrupting her rhythm method of contraception. The sonic booms spelled disaster.
There was no way that any government was going to allow a supersonic airplane to fly routinely over land. And in so doing, it effectively cut about half of all the world's routes away from Concorde.
It was a devastating handicap for a world sales tour.
We were trying to sell it, so we were concentrating on the sales. The problem was there weren't any sales.
Not a single one. Bad news, as Concordes were now rolling off the production line. Worse followed. Airlines canceled their 74 aircraft. Concorde was too noisy, too expensive, too costly to service, and too thirsty in a world facing rising oil prices. Everyone had decided to buy 747s.
No true private commercial airline bought the aircraft. They saw the business model and they realized they weren't going to make money on it, so they didn't buy it. Plain and simple.
$20 billion out of pocket in today's prices, the French and British governments had one last option: to sell Concorde to their own national airlines. Smelling desperation, the airlines drove a hard bargain.
I had to deal with British Airways, and there is not the slightest doubt they screwed me to the floorboards. I mean, basically, we gave it to them.
BA took delivery of 7 shiny new Concordes, and on January 21st, 1976, prepared to take their first passengers supersonic. But there was turbulence ahead. American protesters had persuaded the New York Airport Authority to ban Concorde on grounds of noise.
Concorde's survival depended on its permission to operate between London and New York and New York and London. It had to have the blue ribboned route.
The environmental movement seemed ready to destroy the supersonic dream. The Emergency Coalition to Stop Supersonic Transport led protests against Concorde landing at JFK. Eventually, it was agreed there could be one test flight. On October 19, 1977, Air France pilot Jean Franchi and BA Captain Brian Walpole flew to JFK. Without this crucial transatlantic route, Concorde's future would be in ruins.
And we landed at JFK. There were people down the side of the runway, people along the taxiways, and we were then taken into the moment of truth. We were briefed on what sort of press we were going to get, and we were warned that they would be hostile. That turned out to be a masterpiece in understatement.
Now, another question, gentleman at the back.
One of the very early questions was, how long, Captain Walpole, will it take you to deafen our children with your aeroplane? At this stage, at the back of the hangar, the doors opened and the Concorde was tractored in. Everybody looked round, and as they looked round, you could hear the gasp, the sighs, oh! And the whole of the tenor of that press conference changed as people were heard clearly say, oh, isn't that beautiful? What an aeroplane. Now, that was a moment in Concorde's life that I will never forget, and a moment in my life that I'll never forget.
But Walpole's ordeal was not over. The following morning, Concorde had to run the gauntlet of the noise monitors. Walpole and his team had spent a year devising a cunning scheme to outwit them. By steering away and throttling back the engines over populated areas to reduce noise, Concorde passed the test.
It was so successful, didn't even trigger the noise monitor, let alone get anywhere near the unacceptable level.
Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Brian Walpole, and welcome to Concorde and our supersonic operation from London's Heathrow to New York's John F. Kennedy.
Now at last, Concorde could fly the premium route it so badly needed, taking passengers from London to New York in just 3.5 hours, less than half the time of a conventional jet.
Okay, gents. 3, 2, 1, now.
We took civil aviation from 600 miles an hour to 1,350 miles an hour in one single giant stride.
Concorde is just in a class, in a league all of its own. It was the sort of Grand Prix racing car of the flying world. It was very powerful. It was incredibly responsive. You could just fly it with your thumb and your forefinger.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's Captain Walpole, just to let you know how the flight is progressing, and the answer is quickly.
And I eventually mastered the technique after a couple of slips of carrying 15 or so champagne flutes on a silver tray so as not to have a trip.
Okay, coming up to Mark 1, Mark 1. Here we are, ladies and gentlemen, we're through Mark 1, the speed of sound, no bumps, no bangs, Concorde. 44,000 feet now. The aircraft will gradually climb as the fuel is consumed and the weight decreases, and continuing the acceleration towards the magic of Mark 2. Mark 2, twice the speed of sound.
At this speed, most passengers remained blissfully unaware that Concorde was expanding around them. Friction with the air heated the fuselage from a freezing -69 to a boiling 260 degrees Fahrenheit. Little refrigerators switched on to cool the windows and save anyone from burning their fingers.
I would like to point out to you the extremely fine view of the curvature of the Earth that we have up here today. That is the curvature of...
One of the great pleasures of flying Concorde was looking out of the tiny windows, because you've got this extraordinary landscape with the Earth curving away at the edges Felt like being on a spacecraft.
Leaving Heathrow in the evening gave pilots a sight no human had seen before. Traveling faster than the rotation of the Earth, the sun appeared to rise in the west. Concorde flew so high, so fast, that American spy planes had to be ordered out of the way.
1350 miles an hour, 23 miles a minute, a mile in every 2 3/4 seconds, 10% faster than a rifle bullet, lands end to John O'Groats, 24 minutes, Concorde.
But in the first 6 years of service, Concorde lost money, lots of it. In 1982, BA boss Sir John King decided it was make or break time for Concorde. He called Captain Walpole into his office.
He said, I am going to give you Concorde Division, which is going to be created, and it's up to you, and you form your own team, to turn Concorde's losses into profit in 2 years. He said, if after 2 years it's still losing money for British Airways, then I will terminate the operation.
Failure would spell the end of Concorde and the end of supersonic flight. The new Concorde division set to work. Brian Walpole and Jock Lowe looked at the routes, the fares, the flight timings, the sandwiches, everything. And they asked businessmen how much they thought a ticket on Concorde cost.
Well, most of them didn't know. It was their secretaries of travel companies that were doing the bookings. And when asked to guess, because the senior, very important people, they all guessed that the fare was higher. So very simply, we said, we'll charge them what they think they're paying. And so we put the fares up.
The move was a stroke of pure genius. Ticket prices were doubled to over $7,000 one way in today's prices. Concorde was rebranded to provide a super elite class for merchant bankers, corporate lawyers, the rich, and the famous.
I think flying Concorde full stop made you feel like you were in a club. There was the business class lounge, and then there was the first class lounge, and then there was the Concorde lounge. I mean, you were made to feel that way.
Concorde became the place to be seen. For BA, who'd paid next to nothing for the aircraft, Concorde started to earn real money.
We made about £500 million, £500 million net clear profit. And suddenly now, everybody loved us, and we did. We loved being involved with the aeroplane as well. So it was a wonderful emotion, positive, successful emotion.
For the first time in her life, Concorde's future looked secure. On the 25th of July, 2000. That afternoon, 100 passengers eagerly await Air France Flight 4590 to John F. Kennedy Airport. A German company has specially chartered the Concorde as a spectacular start to a 16-day cruise leaving New York. But there is a delay. The Concorde Air France plans to use, Sierra Charlie, the oldest Concorde in the fleet, has a fault on the thrust reverser on engine number 2. The repairs will hold up the flight for 2 hours. Meanwhile, there is confusion in the dispatch area. Over 1,000 pounds of extra luggage has been loaded without being recorded on the manifest.
C'est bon.
On the flight deck, the crew is keen to take off. The captain is Christian Marty, a French national celebrity, the first man to windsurf the Atlantic. He's ordered the maximum amount of fuel. Concorde needs every drop to get to New York. Marty expects to burn 2 tons just taxiing out to the runway. With the thrust reverser fixed, the passengers finally start to board. The dispatcher brings Marty the manifest. It lists the overall weight, crucial for calculating the takeoff. But without the extra luggage, it shows the aircraft lighter than it is. In the South Air Traffic Control Tower, Concorde's flight controller is Gilles Longelin.
Air France 4590, bonjour.
4590, bonsoir.
The flight recorders give us a record of every word spoken that day.
Le masque à oxygène tombe devant vous, approchez-le de vous et mettez-le devant votre bouche comme nous vous le montrons.
The airport is busy. At the far end of runway 26 right, an Air France 747 waits to cross on its way to the terminal. On board is French President Jacques Chirac, returning from a G8 summit in Japan.
Mesdames et messieurs, nous attendons quelques instants pendant que le Concorde utilise la piste en face de nous.
At 4:42, Captain Marty lines up the Concorde on runway 26 right. They've used only half the taxiing fuel, making the aircraft an additional ton overweight.
Air France 4590, piste 26 droite. Vent 090, 8 nœuds. Décollage autorisé. Est-ce que tout le monde est prêt?
Oui. Oui.
Vers 100, B1, 150, top.
Marty accelerates to V1, the speed at which he is committed to take off.
V1. Attention.
Oula! Concorde 4590, vous avez des flammes derrière vous.
Panne, non, moteur 2. Le matin.
4590, vous avez de fortes flammes derrière vous. Est-ce que tu coupes le réacteur 2 là?
J'ai coupé. Non, le train n'en rentre pas.
Pompier leader, le Concorde, je ne connais pas ses intentions.
Le bunker.
Trop tard.
Steve, on essaie le bunker. Non?
Unable to climb, Captain Marty's last hope was to reach Le Bourget Airport a few miles away.
De Gaulle, tour de pompier leader, vous pouvez me donner la situation du Concorde là?
The flight of Air France 4590 lasted less than 90 seconds. The Concorde crashed 3 miles from the airport into a small hotel close to the town of Gonesse. All 100 passengers, 9 crew, and 4 people on the ground were killed. Patrick Tess, owner of the hotel next door, was just yards away from the point of impact.
So I was in my office on the telephone with my back to the window. Then my conversation was drowned out by an extraordinary noise. I turned around, and there I saw facing me Concorde in flames and at a high angle, approaching the hotel at breakneck speed. And its course made me think it would hit this side. And then I thought I had just a few seconds to live.
Madame Christine Turpin was on her way back from shopping.
And I saw a plane with fire behind it, and I was just stupefied. I saw it was Concorde. I was so surprised to see the plane like that, which went like this, and then it fell like that. I thought he had fallen on my house. I was so surprised. I stopped. I called the fire department. There was no answer. I called my home. No answer. So I left the car and went to the accident site.
One of our clients wrapped himself in a towel soaked in the bath to get closer to the fire. But he came out a few seconds later telling us it's not worth it, don't go there. There's nothing left, just bodies. And actually, we saw that there were bodies, pieces of people.
The aircraft, loaded with fuel, burned for 3 hours. The emergency services placed road cones to mark the human remains. The news flashed around the world. Debris from the crash was taken to hangars at Le Bourget, the airport where Captain Marty had hoped to land. Immediately, the French investigation unit, the BEA, started to look into possible causes. Work colleagues of the dead crew who knew their voices helped decipher the recordings. The BEA was assisted by foreign investigators, including American Robert McIntosh from the National Transportation Safety Board.
We began to get a picture of the sequence of events. Certainly, we knew that there was a normal takeoff. We could hear this on the cockpit voice recorder. The aircraft accelerated up through 100 knots. It accelerated up through 150 knots. At a point of about 175 knots, there were things that were detected by the crew. There were noises. Something was going wrong. And then the heading of the aircraft, which would normally be straight down the runway, began to deviate off to the left.
The investigation switched to the runway. Tire marks clearly showed the path the aircraft had taken, veering left to miss Chirac's 747 by just 30 feet. Chunks of rubber were evidence that one of the Concorde's tires had burst.
This would be like something you might see on a highway that had come from a large truck.
And close by, the possible cause, a 17-inch strip of bent metal.
There was a piece of evidence, a metal strip that appeared to be of the same form as the cut on the tire.
Investigators believed the Concorde had gone over the metal strip, which cut and burst the tire, sending a large chunk of rubber into the wing above.
And it literally broke the bottom of the tank, not by penetrating, but by forcing another part of the bottom of the tank to break loose.
What caused the fuel to ignite was not clear, possibly a spark from a broken electrical cable.
We noticed the aircraft took off early. At that time, there was this huge flame that had developed on the left side, and that's the famous picture that everybody saw.
Flames and debris were sucked into the air intakes, causing both engines to lose power.
On this particular takeoff, it never remotely got near its safety speed, and it never got above about 200 feet.
For the investigation, the question remained, where had the mysterious metal strip come from? Closer inspection revealed it was from the engine of a Continental Airlines DC-10, which had used the same runway just 5 minutes earlier. The French investigators were satisfied that they had solved the cause of the crash. but a number of Concorde pilots and engineers were not.
They're trying to suggest that that single strip of metal was the only reason that Concorde came down. I find totally unbelievable and implausible. Aircraft accidents are seldom down to one thing only. It's a combination of factors. And there were a lot of other factors at play in that day.
One of the central allegations involves a unique feature of Concorde. Fuel can be pumped from a rear tank forward to balance the aircraft for flight. Since the Concorde was overweight, the flight engineer may have moved fuel forward to compensate. At the crash site, switches were found left on, suggesting this could be the case. It may have been that fuel was pumped into Tank 5, the one above the bursting tire, overfilling it.
And so you get this great lump of rubber slamming into the underside of the wing by tank number 5, literally like a missile strike, and it set up a shockwave in the fuel in that tank, and the energy in that shockwave had absolutely nowhere to go because there's no airspace. And I think it is quite reasonable to argue that if the fuel tanks had not been overfilled for that takeoff, and this is my view, I emphasize that, but I think it's quite possible that the subsequent disaster might not have happened.
Air France acknowledges that fuel pumping is normal procedure, but disputes that Tank 5 could have been overfilled.
We transfer between 800 kilos to 1 ton, but always with automatic level detection systems. There cannot be any overfilling of a tank with these systems, which are automatic.
But it is not only operating procedures that have come under scrutiny in the 10 years since the crash. Serious questions have been raised about whether Concorde had fatal design flaws.
A great big buzz going around saying that Concorde was inherently unsafe, it was a fragile bird, and that, quite honestly, in my opinion, is a load of rubbish.
Was Concorde an accident waiting to happen? What exactly caused the Air France Concorde crash and who was to blame has become the subject of a long and bitter court battle. Continental Airlines and 5 individuals from America and France are charged with involuntary manslaughter. All deny the charges. In a glass case lie key exhibits, including the metal strip from the Continental Airlines DC-10 that is alleged to have burst the Concorde's tire. Continental has hired one of France's leading lawyers who argues that the airline is not to blame.
They want to make this strip into the guilty party. It's so much easier to place the blame on others. Can you imagine, for a moment, that a plane could crash because of a small strip measuring 3 centimeters wide, 48 centimeters long, and 1 millimeter thick? Surely a plane could resist that.
Aircraft are built to withstand burst tires, but Concorde's high-speed takeoffs put its tires under much greater stress.
It's very interesting to look at the overall design of the Concorde. It had some vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities was this very high takeoff speed, requiring a ground contact all the way up to almost 200 knots. These things were pretty demanding.
And Concorde has had a record 57 burst or deflated tires, some with near catastrophic results. The most dangerous and dramatic has striking parallels with the 2000 crash. On June 14, 1979, a Concorde flight was leaving Washington for Paris. Among the passengers was an aviation consultant, Bill Lightfoot. His seat window had a view of the wing.
I boarded Concorde, sat down. We then went through the normal pre-takeoff procedures, and then just as the aircraft rotated, getting ready to take off, there was a violent shudder. The aircraft shook like that. And then just almost at the same instant, a large object flashed by my window vertically. And there was a big jagged hole in the wing and some sort of fluid spewing out of the hole. And I was thinking, what would happen if this aircraft tried to go supersonic? There's no doubt in my mind, and engineers I've talked to have said the same. It would have just come apart.
Ma'am, could you please go?
The flight attendant came, and I said, "You've got a problem here. There's a hole in the wing." And she said, "No, that's the flaps." And I said, "No, that is not the flaps." So I told her, "Go get someone. Someone's got to look at that."
Could you please get a flight crew?
Actually, although it's hard to believe, they'd started serving drinks.
Would you like a drink, sir?
No, I don't want a drink. I'd like a flight crew member, please.
Okay, I will inform someone.
So then the co-pilot or engineer came back, and I just literally took his head and pushed it over so he could see out of the small window, like that, so he could see through the hole. He could see this ragged hole in the wing, and he said, "I'll never forget." He said, "Mon Dieu," and he just turned ashen. And then he zipped up the aisle. Then just less than a minute later, they jerked the throttles back, and you could feel the plane violently slow down.
Photographs taken at the time show fuel spilling from the aircraft. 2 tires had exploded, and wheel shrapnel had penetrated the wing. With a shattered undercarriage, the Air France pilot made a difficult landing. Shortly after the incident, France's aviation watchdogs advised further investigation of the wings and possible modifications.
These modifications did not take place. Its recommendations were not implemented. What did the recommendations consist of? To strengthen the fuel tanks with Kevlar.
In fact, the exact same modifications that would be made to Concorde after the 2000 crash.
In other words, if they had followed these recommendations, there would not have been all those deaths.
Airbus, which was then Aerospatiale and Concorde's manufacturer, says that at the time it agreed with aviation authorities to focus on the causes of the Dulles accident rather than the effects, and so the wings were not modified. But possible causes of the Paris crash have also focused on Air France's maintenance, and in particular, a large tubular spacer.
I was looking at the wreckage in the sheds at Le Bourget with a British Airways engineer who had come over to assist, and he noted fairly rapidly that this spacer was missing, and it was in fact found subsequently.
Investigators later found the missing spacer in Air France's workshops. It had been left off Concorde's undercarriage 7 days earlier during routine maintenance.
Clearly, and Air France has always said it, it was a maintenance error.
One of the functions of the spacer was to keep the wheels, the 4 wheels in that undercarriage truck, locked in proper alignment. With the spacer missing, those wheels could wobble around a bit like wheels on a supermarket trolley. Those wheels skewed around and effectively steered the airplane off the left-hand side of the runway.
Missing Chirac 747 by just 30 feet. But the French BEA investigation concluded that the missing spacer had not contributed to the crash.
It's an important question to know whether a missing spacer might be linked in any way with the accident. Clearly, whether it was the BEA or the legal experts, or all the specialists we heard during the trial, they all said no. It had no effect.
Yeah, the BA report concluded that the missing spacer was not relevant to the accident. I believe personally there's an argument to say that the possible effects of this on the steering of the aircraft and on the tyres possibly could be looked at somewhat further.
But the most startling claim by Continental is that 18 eyewitnesses, including firemen and other airline pilots, saw Concorde on fire over 700 yards before it hit the metal strip.
Extraordinaire. Extraordinary. The plane was on fire, and the firefighters were at right angles to the Concorde when it passed in front of them. And firefighters, I think, know what a fire is.
One of those who claims he saw Concorde on fire before it hit the metal strip was a contractor working at the airport.
Around 4 o'clock, I heard the sound of Concorde starting to go, so I turned to look at the aircraft, and then I saw it begin to gain speed, with a small flame under the left side. I said to myself, it won't take off like that. So compared to those who show you where the strip was, the plane was already on fire before that.
When asked, the BEA offered no explanation as to why the eyewitness accounts were not included in its investigation. On this and other issues arising from its report, the BEA said it was not its policy to comment on investigations. The trial judges will give their verdict in the fall.
I have the feeling in this case that everything is being done to protect the image of France, the image of Concorde.
10 years later, Concorde's crash site is surrounded by razor wire. Close by, a memorial stands to the memory of the 113 who died. Back in 2000, to ensure that the accident would never be repeated, bulletproof Kevlar was finally installed in the vulnerable fuel tanks. And new tires were developed that remained intact when punctured, a modification that would benefit all aircraft. The final cost of alterations was over $2 million for each Concorde. In 2001, as the relaunch approached, British Airways signaled its continuing faith in Concorde, splashing out over $20 million on a new interior by the king of modern design, Sir Terence Conran.
Nice, calm color scheme, nothing too jazzy. It was very sophisticated interior, just like a beautiful bit of French fashion. Everything we thought about, everything was meant to symbolize the best British quality.
13 months after the crash, Concorde was ready to take its first passengers. But first, Captain Mike Bannister had to do a complete mock-up flight.
So we planned to have a flight that would go halfway to New York and come back. The pilots will have flown the airplane for the first time with passengers on board for some time, baggage loading, the whole thing.
And the flight went wonderfully. The feel of elation of absolutely everybody on board was fantastic. We were really all up there. And we got off the airplane and my mobile phone rang. And it was my youngest son. He was saying, "Dad, have you heard what's happened in New York?"
And we had landed back at Heathrow just before the first airplane crashed into the World Trade Center.
And then my son said, "Oh my God, an airplane's hit the other tower." And at that point, we looked at each other and knew exactly what this meant. It was so sad.
That day, Concorde lost 40 of its most frequent flyers. and Concorde's lifeblood, the business community, stopped traveling across the Atlantic. But Concorde was ready to fight back. During the Queen's Golden Jubilee, the nation's pride soared as a British Concorde reappeared in public after the Air France crash.
As we got close to the palace and sort of came over Admiralty Arch and looked down the Mall, something really astounding happened. I've never seen 1 million plus people. 1 million people not very far away because we were flying at just over 300 meters above the ground. And you could see them waving and cheering, waving flags and hats and throwing things in the air. It was astoundingly emotional. And you could see Her Majesty standing on the balcony, and she happened to be wearing a flame orange outfit, and so you could see her quite clearly. And that really was fantastic, and to be part of something like that was brilliant.
Concorde was back, but in the post-9/11 world, revenues were down. And for Air France, matters were even worse. On some flights, the airline flew with only 6 paying passengers in its 100 seats. Then, Air France had a scare with another Concorde. On a scheduled flight to the US, an engine failed. The failure was not itself a crisis, but it caused a massive fuel leak. With tanks almost empty, the Air France Concorde only just made it to Halifax International in Nova Scotia.
Now that of itself was quite a serious incident, and so perhaps it didn't come as a huge surprise when we were starting to get a feeling that they were seriously thinking about stopping operating.
Faced with escalating costs, Air France debated whether Concorde had had its day. At the same time, Airbus, who kept the Concorde fleet airworthy, announced that maintenance charges would have to go up by nearly $60 million over 2 years. BA had already spent millions of dollars refitting Concorde. Now it was confronted with the news of more costs, and without Air France, it decided it couldn't go it alone.
And I'm sorry to say British Airways, rather weakly in my opinion, rolled over and capitulated to this French ultimatum. And so I get very upset about the way in which Concorde ended its life.
Just 17 months after the relaunch, BA and Air France announced they were retiring their Concorde fleets. It was the end of over 27 years of supersonic travel.
Could have carried on technically, of course. It could carry on now. It could carry on for another 20 years. But it would cost more, and there simply wasn't the demand or the commercial drive to do it.
In aviation terms, the Concordes were mere spring chickens, with only a quarter of the wear of an average 747.
It symbolized optimism. It was everything that the 20th century could have stood for.
I walked out of the hangar, the last person to leave, and it was misty and there were neon lights. And as I crossed the tarmac, there were 5 perfectly serviceable Concordes sitting there that I knew would never ever carry a fare-paying passenger again. And I think that's the first time that the emotional side of what had happened really hit me.
Of the 20 Concordes ever built, 18 remain, attracting millions of visitors at museums across the world. Her elite class of pilots either retired or were relegated to flying lesser aircraft. During the final flights, Flight engineers stuck their caps in a gap that opened up as the aircraft expanded with supersonic speed. Now they remain wedged forever in the cold fuselages. At the Udvar-Hazy Center of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum is Concorde Foxtrot Alpha. Once the pride of the Air France fleet, it opens services to many destinations around the world, including Washington, D.C.
We were promised a Concorde back in 1989. We had no idea it was going to come to us as early as it did. We expected it maybe now, in 2010. Frankly, I sort of expected it no earlier than 2020.
Today, Concorde holds a prominent place in aviation's Hall of Fame. But for the time being, the supersonic dream is over.
Concorde was a way of life for us, a complete way of life, one of which we were intensely proud.
Concorde gave us that aspiration, that dream, that focus, that pride, and just that lovely picture of it flying overhead.
To me, it was a fusion of art and technology. Oh, I sort of live it. It's sort of inside me, Concorde.
She's arguably one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century. She was and is amazing.